Protests in Iraq over high unemployment and corruption have left at least 100 people dead and thousands of others injured in clashes with the military. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. This week's protests mark the biggest challenge yet for Iraqi Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi since taking power a year ago. For days, thousands of young men rallied across Baghdad against corruption, failed public services and high unemployment. At least 104 protesters have been killed and 6,000 injured in the unrest. The Iraqi government has admitted using excessive force to end the demonstrations and is promising several social reforms. 2 years after declaring the defeat of ISIS, Iraq is still struggling to rebuild destroyed cities and bring thousands of displaced people home. For more on the challenges facing Iraq, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Baghdad is Ahmed Rushdi. He's the senior policy advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament and the director of the House of Iraqi Expertise Foundation. Also with us from Washington, D.C. via Skype is Bilal Wahab. He's the Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. From London, Abdel Bari Atwan is the editor-in-chief of the digital Arab news and opinion site al-Youm. And Harlan Ullman is chairman of the Killowen Group and senior advisor with the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. He's with me in the studio right now. Welcome to all of you to the show. Ahmed Rushdi, let's start in Baghdad and let's look at the situation in Iraq right now. Iraq is ranked 168 out of 180 countries when it comes to corruption. That's according to Transparency International's Corruption Index. We've seen many reports that tell us that economic mismanagement and missed opportunities have led to widespread unemployment. The country has a water crisis. It has an electricity crisis. People have taken to the streets and the government is responding with gunfire. What is your assessment of the situation in Iraq right now?
Well, actually now it's Baghdad and the other governorates, Iraqi governorates, it's become more calmer. It's the demands, the demonstrations demand was written and also was admitted by the parliament as recommendations for the Iraqi government. And today the prime minister will have a speech about those demands and in front of the Iraqi people. He will ask for more patience and that all those demands that have been declared by the parliament, it will be passed to the Iraqi government, it will be applied by the Iraqi government. The most important thing, the demonstration was a huge message on the shoulder of the prime minister, on the shoulder of the parliament, even the president, and the whole system and the whole Iraqi system. We all know that there are so many problems that as products for this system, for the Iraqi system. And I think now it become more and more serious for the officials, for the politician, for the Iraqi politician inside the parliament, inside the Iraqi government, to work hard, not only for the demonstrations demands, but also that have strategic relationship, to build up a strategic relationship, to build up strategic financial relationship with the neighboring countries and also with the international community to try to manage to get up from what's happening now in Iraq.
Right. Bilal Wahab, is it fair to ask Iraqis to have more patience? We've seen millions of people driven to poverty because of endemic corruption in the country and mismanagement. How serious is this crisis in the country?
Good to be with you. I believe the crisis is serious because it's not the government, the failure of a particular government or a cabinet or failure in a particular sector. I think this is a systemic failure. This post-2003 system has failed in providing good governance, services, jobs, especially for the younger demographics of Iraq. Let's not forget that 60% of the Iraqi population is below the age of 24. Therefore, the identity politics that permeates throughout the system, whereby Sunnis and Shias and Kurds find representation and form big tent governments in the absence of an opposition, has failed in translating that representational system into roads and hospitals and healthcare and schools, and most importantly, jobs for that younger demographic. That is why the protest is so massive on one hand, but also the anger is targeted at not a particular group or sect or party, but at the entirety of the system, which I think puts the onus on this particular government, which is a capable government, but it has inherited long-lasting structural problems, whether they're going to perform some of those deep reforms that the public demands, or perhaps if they fail at those reforms, economic and political reforms, then perhaps these protests will escalate into demanding greater change to the political system itself.
Harlan, Iraq has endured years of war, of course, and we still see a lot of violence in the country. Is it heading in the direction of becoming a failed state, or is it there already?
It's already there. Its constitution was flawed when it was put in place by the Coalition Provisional Authority in 2003. The divisions between the three ethnic groups are not going to work. The government has to be based on competence. That's simply not going to happen. And the report that you just got from Baghdad from Mr. Rushdi was depressing in the extreme. I suspect that the riots will get worse when you overlay it with the possibility of the Islamic State or al-Qaeda or one of the more revolutionary groups coming back into Iraq. You have the possibility of another civil war breaking out. The role of Iran in this also has to be considered. And really, there's no outside support. Colin Powell said famously about Afghanistan and Iraq, you own it, you break it. You break it, you own it.
You break it, you own it.
And that's what's exactly happening right now. And I don't think there's any good way out. You take a look at what's happening at the broader Gulf with Iran, the attacks against Saudi Arabia, what's happening right now in Iraq, and the situation is really grim. The Americans are being seen to withdraw. In some cases, that may not be a bad thing, but there's no central leadership. There's no way of coming to grips. I don't know how any government in Iraq right now would be able to deal with the necessities that are being demanded by the protesters in terms of jobs, food, water, electricity. The problem is massive, and I fear it's going to get a lot worse.
Abdel Bari Atwan, we just heard Bilal Wahab tell us a moment ago that there is a systemic problem in Iraq. These issues that the country is facing right now is not confined to a single government. It's been facing several governments in that country. Why is the system so dysfunctional? I mean, here we have an oil-rich country. The war with ISIS ended almost 2 years ago. There's been no peace dividend.
Well, I do agree with Mr. Wahab, several points which he raised, but I would like to emphasize here the problem of Iraq is actually wider than that. I believe the sectarian problem. I believe also the corruption which is at its peak. I believe that corruption of the political system, elite system in Iraq. I think this kind of sectarianism is destroying the country. And what amazed me, more than $1 billion, more than 800 or $900 billion were actually stolen out of Iraq in the last 16 years. So why the governmental elite, why they did not actually try to amend the damages, why they did not create a political system, and why there wasn't transparency among them, why this sectarianism actually destroyed the country. The other point is there is no national Iraqi identity. Until now, there is, you can see there is Shia, there is Sunni, there is Kurds, but there is no Yazidis, but there is no Iraqi identity or collective identity until now. This is the biggest problem which is facing the Iraqi elites and also the Iraqi people. Now, the people of Iraq, you are absolutely correct. You said it is a rich country. Yes, it is a rich country. $6 billion a month is the income of the Iraqi from oil revenue. Where this money is spent? Who stole most of them? I believe the sectarianism is the biggest problem facing Iraq. Unless they solve this problem, unless there is a real coexistence between the Iraqi people, unless there is understanding, I think the problem will be prolonged, and I think we will have more intifada, more actually demonstration in the streets in the coming few months. We had the same promises that we need time. We know the problem. We will solve it. But Until now, for the last 16 years, there is no solution at all, so the problem is there.
Okay. Bilal Wahab, I just want to get back to your point on the problem being systemic in the country. The problem may be systemic, and as Harlan Ullman pointed out as well, the country has a constitution that was imposed on it by the Americans. But how does that explain the incredible levels of corruption in the country right now?
The answer is simple. The main revenue of the country is from oil exports, as Mr. Atwan mentioned, and all of that money flows into the coffers of the government, and therefore that is the prize, and that's the ultimate prize for the political game. So all the political parties compete in order to be in government, to be in parliament, and then win positions. That is competition over patronage, all the way to the lowest level in the bureaucracy. And this system basically enriches the political parties who are in government. And that's why no one wants to be the opposition. In fact, just this year, for the first time, there is an opposition in parliament. So it's everyone is in the government, and therefore a government of everyone is a government of no one. And that is the main problem that the protesters are facing, because no one can be held accountable. Such a kind of a Big Tent government is representative, okay, but it cannot provide governance and it cannot provide services. But also, when it fails, no one can take the responsibility for it, and hence the protests were broadly raging at the entirety of the system and not a particular group.
Right. Ahmed Rushdi, just a moment ago, Harlan Ullman painted a very grim picture of the situation in Iraq right now and its future. The Iraqi cabinet has offered some reforms, about a dozen reforms, including land redistribution, military enlistment, and increased welfare stipends for needy families. Firstly, have any of those reforms been implemented, and do they really get to the core of what the problem is? I mean, we've heard from more than one of our guests today that the problem is, how do all the different groups in Iraq get together?
Well, let's be serious about sectarianism. It actually was the cover for corruption for the whole 14 years until the liberation of Iraqi territories from Daesh. Then it became obvious that it was not sectarianism, it was corruption. And after 2 years, we saw the demonstrations, how much it was huge and massive, and most of them, they are young men, and 90% they are Shia. So you can imagine is that there is no sectarianism anymore in Iraq, but there is corruption, there is no jobs, and there is a huge kind of deficit in the Iraqi budget. Now, for the reforms, it's obvious that those reforms can be temporary, as temporary solutions, and it's obvious that it will happen. But the most important thing is on the long run. It's supposed to be that the Iraqi government should work hard on how to deal with those problems in a way to have help from the international community and also from the neighboring country to solve the main problem that Iraq has inside the bureaucratic structure, which is corruption. Now, the other thing is that the Prime Minister, I think in the next 2 days, he will announce some sort of a change inside the cabinet, changing ministers without going to the parliament. And it looks like that he will change about 6 ministers, Minister of Planning, of Electricity, of Migration, and also Agriculture, Industry, and also Electricity. So he is going forward to those reforms. Let us be honest also how much he has a power to do those reforms. It is also a very important question because he does not have a bloc that support him inside the parliament. So how he can be in front of the political blocs, which supported him until now with this crisis. So all these questions needed to be answered by the Prime Minister himself.
Yeah, what you've just said points to the divisions again. Harlan, Ahmed Rushdi just said that what Iraq needs right now is international help, assistance from the outside. How will that fix the country?
It won't. And who wants to invest in Iraq? It would be seen as wasted money given the fact that Iraq has got all this oil. I think the real dangers lie ahead, or rather there becomes a huge bloodbath in which not 100 people are killed, but many thousands. There's also the possibility, as I said, of radicalism taking over. Think about Russia in 1917, Lenin supposing the Islamic State or the more radicals take over. Or thirdly, and it's not out of the question, you might have a strong man arise, another Saddam Hussein, somebody in the military, one of the security services who sees the situation desperate, and a strong man is required for the circumstances. So I see right now Iraq a powder keg.
Well,
I'm not sure the government is going to be strong enough to deal with it, and the outcome is very uncertain.
Looking at the government's response right now, I'm wondering
It's trivial.
You know, what...
Going to fire a couple of people, what is that going to do? Is that going to bring bread on the table, electricity to people? Of course not. There need to be radical reforms immediately. I don't think the government, and it's not a fault of this government, but the nature of Iraq is such that nobody's going to be able to deliver that short of a strong man emerging. And does Iraq want to be ruled by another Saddam Hussein?
Abdel Bari Atwan, the Iraqi president, Baham Saleh, he addressed the country on Monday, just hours after the military actually admitted that it used excessive force in dealing with the demonstrations. Let's listen to part of what the Iraqi president had to say.
The targeting of peaceful demonstrators and security forces with live ammunition, and the targeting of the media and journalists is unacceptable for an Iraq that we've pledged to keep a democracy in which rights and freedoms are preserved.
So, Abdel Bari Atwan, very profound words there from the Iraqi president, but we hear nothing about accountability, about bringing to, you know, asking people to account for the actions that these military forces took against demonstrators.
You are absolutely right. I believe this government, when they admitted that they used the excess of power against those young demonstrators, I think this is a crime, to be honest. Those people took over in Iraq in order not to repeat what Saddam Hussein atrocities used to be. So they are repeating the same atrocities. That's why, to be honest, many people, many young people in Iraq are looking or longing for the era of Saddam Hussein. You know, they say, okay, what's the difference between you and Saddam Hussein? This is one point. The other point is the Prime Minister of Iraq is very weak, to be honest. He is not supported by any of these large parties. So he is there because he is weak, not because he is strong. And I agree with Mr. Rushdi. Okay, maybe changing ministers could do something, but this is not the problem. You need a strong government to actually challenge the militia in Iraq, challenge these sectarian parties which is in full control and they are extremely corrupt. Without that, I don't think there will be any solution to the problems. Okay, maybe they will bury the rubbish under the bed or under the carpet, but this is not the solution the Iraqi people looking for. So maybe they will quiet the situation a bit, but I believe there will be a flare-up. Look at this demonstration took place in the Shia area, not in the Sunni one. The Shia, the incubator of the ruling elite here. So when the ruling elite betraying their own people, their own supporters, so it means there is a huge mistake, or there is something wrong in this elite. So how they are going to rectify this, I cannot see honestly any solution. And I believe there should be transparency, there should be accountability, there should be actually drastic measures to be taken in order to root out the corruption.
Anon, this is a tragedy that's unfolding, and the difficulty with this discussion is that all of us have been equally pessimistic. And the question is not what has happened or why it's happening, but what is a favorable outcome? What is the best that can be possibly achieved, and how does that happen? Or is the pessimism that's being reflected by your four participants going to play out into a further tragedy unfolding? What can be done that's not being done? And is there any realistic chance of that happening to change the situation in Iraq?
Right. Ahmed Rushdi, on the question of what can be done, if this continues, if there are no fundamental changes, possibly even a new constitution for the country, could this get even worse? The French news agency, AFP, they ran a piece today in which it said that these protests are the biggest security and political challenge for the Prime Minister since his government took power about a year ago, and it's reviving fears of a new spiral of violence that could actually suck in the militia groups, the very influential militia groups in Iraq. Do you agree with that?
Well, on the way of what's happened in the last Tuesday, it looks like it's accumulated. It didn't happen on Tuesday. It happened when the Minister of Health resigned. Then demonstrations happen for the younger men and women who has postgraduate certificates in front of the Prime Ministry. Then the transfer of Abdel Wahab Saadi, General Abdel Wahab Saadi, who is well known that he fought Daesh bravely. Then demonstration happened in Mosul against the demolition of the statue of Abdel Wahab Saadi. Then this demonstration, it blasted in the face of the Prime Minister in Tuesday. So it is not a one-day shot. It was accumulated against the Prime Minister. This is first. Secondly, let us be honest, it's also accumulated for about those 14 years. It all blasted in his face. On the other hand, what we are talking about reforms inside the political process, inside the economical process also. In the political process, our only bonus after 2003 is our parliamentary system. That's it. Going forward for something called presidential, or let's say more about one man can lead, I don't think it will be very profitable for Iraqis, because if it is one man, that means corruption will be in the hand of his followers.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is the reforms inside the economical system inside Iraq. It can be happen. The Prime Minister tried actually to do something, especially his trip to China, tried to sign so many deals there, and it tried to manage something called soft loans, $10 billion that it will be the Chinese $10 billion, the Chinese soft loan, in a way to try to rehabilitate the infrastructure projects in Iraq. I'm not saying it will be a magical stick. I'm saying is that actually our anxious, or let's say our the most important enemy is we are not going to be inside a chaotic situation. This is the most important thing, because if Iraq will go forward for the chaotic situation, that means Iraq will be a real failure state.
Bilal Wahab, if we look at what the Prime Minister wants to do, what he can do, he has been talking about unemployment in the country. In fact, World Bank figures show that youth unemployment in Iraq is running at about 25%. But this is what he had to say on that issue. Let's watch this.
We have not created unemployment, and we have not destroyed the infrastructure. We have inherited this. We have found large accumulations in every sector. This is not a derogation of our predecessors' efforts, but it is the reality that you all know the reasons behind.
So, Bilal, there we have the Prime Minister basically saying, hey, look, not my fault, I inherited this mess. Is he playing a bit of a blame game here?
That's the irony. He is right. And so was his predecessor, and so was the one before him. And that's the challenge. That's what I was referring to earlier, that accountability is elusive, because everyone can blame someone else. The first Prime Minister could blame Saddam Hussein and the wars and the invasion, and the subsequent Prime Ministers could blame the weather and God, and as long as they don't hold accountability and responsibility for what's going on. So you give 16 years of that, this is the result, but 16 more years of this, back to your question earlier about patience, is going to result in the same thing. So the question is, what can be done? Politically speaking, back to your earlier questions also about reforms, the electoral system is due for some serious reforms. The Constitution, despite its flaws, in fact, is one of the best things in Iraq, because it provides for checks and balances. But the implementation of the Constitution, the way that it has been operated and operationalized by the political parties, has been to their own benefit rather than to the benefit of the citizenry.
Right.
So the election system needs to be amended, and the constitutional article about the winners and losers of election has to be clearly delineated. So for the first time in Iraq, we can have those who are empowered to be in government and therefore have a mandate, and those who are opposition, rather than a government of everyone, and therefore no accountability. I think that's an important one.
Okay.
Second, it's time for Iraq economically to shed the state control nature of the economy, because it has failed to create jobs. The bureaucracy is bloated. 50% of the 111 2019 budget is going to public salaries, and Iraq is one of the highest, has the highest number of employees, or one of the highest in the world. So this government, despite all of that, is failing to invest in the infrastructure, because there's literally no money, no capital left there. So it's to open the market,
All right.
allow entrepreneurship to grow,
Anand.
and open up the Iraqi market also for foreign direct investment. It's not just the security, because the security situation has been better since the defeat of ISIS. It's the policy and the regulations.
All right, Harlan?
I think the best outcome right now is that these series of revolts by the youth will burn themselves out. And that will paper over some period of time where there may be some return to some peace and measures of stability. But the fundamental issues that are really plaguing Iraq are not going to be settled. And at some stage, there is going to be a huge explosion. In my view, the only question is when.
Yeah, it's going to resurface at some point.
You bet. And it may resurface now, but I suspect the best outcome is that if this burns itself out for the time being, that does not resolve the symptoms and the causes.
Okay, Abdel Bari Atwan, there is another risk for Iraq right now, considering if you look at its recent history. In September, 12 people were killed in an explosion in Karbala, which is just southwest of Baghdad. ISIS claimed responsibility for that. Could we see a resurgence of ISIS in Iraq?
Oh, yes. I believe this is the best or the fertile environment for ISIS to thrive again, to come back again. Because as long as this corruption actually is spreading all over the country, as long as there is a competition or rivalities between the American and the Iranian to control the country. And unfortunately, the Iranian and the American agreed on one thing and differs in many things, all things. They agreed on keeping the corruption in order actually to divide the country. So as long as we cannot have a unifying identity of Iraq, a unifying loyalty to the system, to the state, I think, yes, the explosion is coming, definitely. Now, ISIS is waiting for the opportunity. I believe now, that Turkish invasion of the north of Syria will create a havoc there again. And now here, the corruption in Iraq, the semi-failed state or the failed state there, this is what ISIS is looking for. So I wouldn't be surprised personally if ISIS emerged again and managed to manipulate the situation in Syria and Iraq, and they will find many people who are actually frustrated because of this situation. So we have to be very, very careful here. Yes, ISIS is coming back. President Trump is withdrawing his troop. He is withdrawing from the whole of the Middle East, who will be exploiting the situation there. It is ISIS, it is radicalism, and the problem is the Iraqi elite, actually, they are not aware of this, or they don't want. Nepotism is there, corruption is there, the lack of national identity is not there. So this is what Iraq is suffering. The Iranian and the American are competing to keep Iraq weak in order to actually increasing and strengthening their influence in the country. There is no army. There is no Iraqi army at all. There is militia, no Iraqi army, no Iraqi identity, no Iraqi people who are caring about the country. I mean the elite caring about the country, caring about the young people. So explosion is coming.
Very quickly. All right, very quickly, Harlan.
The last thing that the United States wants is to keep Iraq weak. That is a misstatement, and that is a misperception. That is simply untrue.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.